Have you ever noticed that the starting point of a severed relationship between great powers is rarely the deafening roar of artillery fire, but rather a few seemingly calm yet violently undercurrent diplomatic words? Just a few days ago, the Japanese government officially released its diplomatic blue book for 2026. In this seemingly dry and bureaucratic document, the official positioning of China underwent a highly symbolic and dangerous mutation. The phrasing was brutally downgraded from one of the most important bilateral relationships directly to a mere important neighbor. Do not underestimate the deletion of these few words. This is neither a rumor nor a wild guess. It is a finalized, ironclad reality, marking a critical step in Japan actively downgrading its ties with Beijing. To understand the sheer magnitude of this strategic pivot, we must look at the cold, hard numbers. China and Japan share a massive economic lifeline, with bilateral trade consistently hovering around a staggering $300 billion annually. China is not just a neighbor. It has historically been the fundamental economic bedrock and the absolute core partner for Japan's prosperity. To suddenly relabel the anchor of your own economic survival as a dispensable entity is terrifyingly abnormal. It clearly signals that Tokyo is now willing to forcibly sever its most vital economic artery for the sake of aggressive geopolitical maneuvering. In the realm of international relations, diplomatic language is never casual. Every single word is meticulously weighed, acting as a precise seismograph for a nation's strategic shifts. Calling China one of the most important relationships meant that despite any friction, stabilizing ties with Beijing was Tokyo's absolute priority. But an important neighbor, that sounds polite on the surface. Yet it is freezing to the bone. It implies that no matter how massive China's economic or physical footprint is, to Japan, it is now merely adjacent by geographical coincidence. It is no longer a core relationship to be carefully maintained. What was once the absolute priority has now become entirely expendable. This is not just a minor revision of vocabulary. It is a calculated psychological preparation for a total future fallout. Think of it as a desperate captain quietly cutting the heavy steel anchor rope of his ship while a Category 5 hurricane is rapidly forming on the horizon. He is silently, deliberately preparing to let the vessel drift directly into the storm. Japan's true mentality is completely exposed here. They will now only deal with China when strictly necessary. A nation that begins to erase you from its foundational documents is a nation that has already drawn its sword in the dark. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs recently delivered a response that completely shattered Japan's attempt to shift blame. Spokesperson Mao Ning pointed out the undeniable truth. The root of the current diplomatic deadlock is not found in Beijing, but lies squarely in Tokyo. It stems directly from the absurd and treacherous rhetoric regarding Taiwan propagated by Japanese politicians. When influential figures like Sanai Takaichi openly declare that a Taiwan emergency is synonymous with a Japanese emergency and label it a matter of life and death, they are crossing a massive red line. Let US rewind the clock to September 29, 1972. On that historic day, the Sino-Japanese joint communique was signed. This document served as the absolute political bedrock for normalized relations between the two Asian giants. In black and white, Japan explicitly recognized that there is only one China and fully respected that Taiwan is an inalienable part of Chinese territory. This solemn promise was the master key that unlocked over 50 years of peace and staggering economic dividends for the entire region. But today, Tokyo is actively taking a sledgehammer to that very foundation. by binding the Taiwan issue to Japan's own national survival. They are blatantly interfering in China's internal affairs and tearing up the four political documents that anchor the relationship. Anyone familiar with history knows that this survival rhetoric is not a modern diplomatic strategy. It is a terrifying echo of the past. Before launching the full-scale invasion of China in the 1930s, and just prior to the devastating sneak attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the imperial cabinet used the exact same excuse of national survival to justify their ruthless expansion. This rhetoric is a geopolitical zombie. It is the blood-soaked ghost of 20th century imperialism, crawling out of its historical grave, putting on a modern diplomatic suit, and pretending to be a vulnerable victim. By deliberately downgrading diplomatic ties, Tokyo believes it can pressure Beijing into accepting this absurd interference. They are trying to muddy the waters and force a new status quo. But they have severely miscalculated the resolve of the Chinese people. The Taiwan issue is the absolute core of China's core interests. A nation that uses its neighbor's sovereign territory as an excuse for its own military resurrection is not preparing for defense. It is actively writing the prologue to a new catastrophe. Why would Japan willingly provoke its largest neighbor and sacrifice massive trade deals for an island that does not belong to it? The answer is hidden deep within Japan's modern history of invasion, and the island nation obsession carved into its very bones. To understand this, we must look at the terrifying reality of the island dilemma. Geographically, Japan is a resource-starved archipelago. Over 90% of its energy imports, and almost all of its crucial maritime trade, must pass directly through or adjacent to the Taiwan Strait. To Tokyo, these waters are not just a shipping lane. They are the vital jugular vein of their entire national economy. This geopolitical claustrophobia has driven their actions for generations. In 1874, using the shipwrecked Ryukyuan sailors incident as a flimsy pretext, Japan ruthlessly deployed troops to invade Taiwan. This was not a random skirmish. It was the calculated first step of their notorious continental policy, the exact starting point of their violent outward expansion. Back then, Japan wanted to use Taiwan as a springboard to devour the Asian mainland step by step and expand into Southeast Asia. Over 100 years have passed, yet the geopolitical landscape remains unchanged, and Japan's underlying ambitions remain exactly the same. To this island nation, Taiwan is the grand drawbridge of the Pacific Castle. If China achieves complete reunification and firmly controls the Taiwan Strait, Japan fears that this drawbridge will be pulled up forever. They are terrified of being completely sealed off in the Southeast Asian maritime domain, forever losing any space for outward expansion, and finally shattering their long-held obsession with landing on the continent. Behind this aggressive posturing lies a deep-seated, almost pathological dread. Ancient legends of the sinking archipelago have cursed them with an instinctual fear of being trapped at sea. This deeply rooted survival anxiety is the true reason they view the Taiwan issue as their own life and death threshold. And a nation that views the rightful territorial integrity of its neighbor as a fatal threat to its own existence is a nation trapped in a prison of its own historical paranoia. Why does Japan constantly test China's patience, yet cower in absolute silence before the United States and Russia? In popular perception, the classic animal representing the bully who fears the strong is the dog. And as the old saying goes, a dog threatens others only when backed by a powerful master. Throughout history, from ancient times to the modern era, Japan's provocations against China have never. It is driven by a toxic mix of greed and geopolitical speculation, relying on China's historical tolerance to push the envelope time and time again. Consider the Battle of Bagang in the Tang Dynasty, or the Imjin War in the Ming Dynasty. Even after catastrophic defeats, Chinese forces did not exterminate them or invade the Japanese home islands. Instead, China exported civilization, offered forgiveness, and let them retreat safely to their archipelago. Even after the immense tragedy of the full-scale invasion of China in World War II, which caused over 35 million Chinese casualties, Japan did not pay the ultimate price. War criminals were treated with leniency, and massive war reparations were ultimately waived. Thousands of years of history have instilled a deeply twisted cognitive bias into the Japanese strategic mindset. Provoking China is a zero-risk endeavor, where losing means you break even, but winning, as they did in the First Sino-Japanese War by extracting massive wealth, means you hit the jackpot and become an empire. But against Washington and Moscow, they do not even dare to breathe loudly. The United States used the iron fist of overwhelming, apocalyptic violence to teach Japan a lesson it will never forget. During World War II, when the Japanese cabinet screamed for the suicidal shattered jade defense of 100 million citizens, the United States did not negotiate. Instead, General Curtis LeMay orchestrated unprecedented firebombing campaigns in just one night in March 1945. Operation Meeting House incinerated Tokyo, leaving over 100,000 dead in a sea of fire. In total, 98 cities were reduced to ashes. Today, the US occupies their land, commands their military, and grips their economic throat. Japan kneels as an obedient servant, fully surrendering its sovereignty. As for Russia, the fear is literally frozen into their marrow. At the end of the war, the Soviet Red Army captured 600,000 elite Kwantung Army soldiers, packing them like sardines into cargo trains, destined for the brutal Siberian gulags, in the -40-degree wasteland, dying from frostbite, starvation, and grueling slave labor became a daily routine. Nearly a third of them perished in the snow, and the survivors lived the rest of their lives in a waking nightmare. Today, when Russian nuclear bombers circle the disputed Kuril Islands, Tokyo barely issues a whisper of protest. They know Moscow will not hesitate to deliver a fatal blow and exact the price of national extinction. Japan's geopolitical calculus operates precisely like a predatory casino gambler. When sitting across from a civilized, forgiving dealer, they audaciously bet the house on every hand. But the moment a ruthless enforcer presses a loaded gun against their temple, they do not even possess the courage to look at their own cards. Admission that only comprehends the brutal language of absolute violence will inevitably and tragically mistake historical benevolence for inherent weakness. So, knowing they instinctively cower before absolute power, why does Tokyo continue its relentless, stealthy provocations against Beijing? Because they are playing a cowardly, high-stakes game of proxy harassment. Today, Japan avoids the blazing inferno of direct warfare. Instead, they rely on a barrage of calculated microaggressions, fanning the flames over the Taiwan Strait, manufacturing friction around the Diaoyu Islands, and erecting high industrial barriers. They calculate that these low-cost actions will steadily erode China's patience. But behind this bravado lies a suffocating domestic panic. Japan is a rapidly aging society, paralyzed by economic stagnation and rigid class divides. They desperately need an external enemy to distract from their internal rot. More importantly, the very foundation of their national pride is crumbling. China has systematically dismantled Japan's industrial crown jewels. Look at the automotive sector. once the undisputed engine of the Japanese economy. Today, China's new energy vehicles and solar panel technologies have completely eclipsed Japan's legacy industries, aggressively squeezing Tokyo out of the global market. Sensing this desperation, Washington has gleefully stepped in, eager to push Japan onto the front line as its ultimate proxy. It is a cynical, parasitic marriage of convenience. America uses Japan to contain China's meteoric rise, while Japan uses American backing to finally untether its dormant military-industrial complex. They are rapidly deploying long-range offensive missiles and actively tearing up the pacifist constraints of their constitution, exposing their reawakened militaristic fangs, faced with this aggressive encirclement. How must Beijing respond? The answer is a suffocating, multi-dimensional counterstrike. Militarily, the persistent combat readiness patrols in the Taiwan Strait and the East China Sea must form an unbreakable iron curtain, demonstrating that any violation of sovereignty will be met with immediate, overwhelming retaliation. Economically, China holds the ultimate trump card, rare earth elements. Beijing currently dominates over 80% of the global rare earth refining capacity. These precise minerals are the absolute lifeblood of Japan's high-end manufacturing, stealth fighters, and advanced missile systems. If Tokyo insists on acting as the hostile spearhead for a foreign hegemon, Beijing must surgically snap the wooden shaft of that spear by tightening export controls and cutting off their technological oxygen. This diplomatic downgrade is not a loss for Beijing. It is Tokyo's self-written geopolitical obituary, a nation that attempts to resurrect its imperial ghosts by serving as a disposable pawn for a declining superpower, will inevitably find itself crushed by the unstoppable continental drift of history. History is a ruthless mirror. A nation unable to face its past, attempting to find security by acting as a proxy for an extra-regional hegemon, will ultimately be swallowed by the fears it weaves. China's rise is a continental drift forged by the will of 1.4 billion people. And any island nation attempting to place stumbling blocks before its wheels will be crushed. Like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. How do you think Japan's massive gamble will ultimately end?